Today, we're diving into a seriously fascinating side of psychology, how cognitive limits actually reveal themselves in our everyday behaviors, rather than just in test scores. You know, most people think of intelligence merely as a number on a page, right? But psychologists know that cognitive ability reveals itself far more clearly in how we act and react in our daily lives. So, we're going to unpack 7 distinct habits that point to real, tangible limits in how a human mind processes reality.
So is intelligence really just about solving puzzles in a quiet room? Not exactly. The true marker of how a mind processes the world is often found in our everyday habits, specifically a repeated failure to adapt. If you recognize these behaviors in yourself, or, let's be honest, in others around you, pay close attention. They aren't just quirky personality traits. They are literal windows into the mechanical limitations of human cognition.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll look at beyond the test score, limits in processing reality, time and self-control, when feelings override facts, and finally, cognitive realities.
All right, Section 1, Beyond the Test Score, Rethinking Cognitive Ability. Let's jump right past the traditional IQ test and look at real-world adaptation.
Moving into Section 2, Limits in Processing Reality, How the Mind Handles Complexity. We're looking at 3 distinct habits here: mental rigidity, concrete thinking, and the avoidance of complexity. These directly stem from a mind that is just easily overwhelmed. When the brain lacks the cognitive architecture to process multiple layers of meaning, it forces the individual to prioritize absolute certainty over deep analysis. They do this just to manage the sheer cognitive load of everyday life. Think of it kind of like a computer with way too many tabs open. It has to close everything else down completely just to keep the main system from crashing. Now, what's really interesting is how psychologists tie mental rigidity directly to poor executive function, which is the brain's ability to shift strategies. When presented with new information, a person with lower cognitive ability really struggles to update their thinking. Why? Well, because updating thinking feels deeply threatening. Flexibility requires cognitive resources they simply do not have at their disposal. You might hear people say their mind operates like a locked door, and honestly, that brilliantly illustrates the situation. But it's crucial to understand that this isn't simple stubbornness or an intentional refusal to listen. It is a genuine cognitive limit in processing reality. The mental hinges are simply stuck because the processing power to open the door just isn't there. When we talk about concrete thinking, you'll notice how the gray areas, the nuance, just completely vanish. Abstract ideas, metaphors, hypotheticals, they become genuine, frustrating puzzles. Life gets interpreted completely literally because navigating ambiguity simply overloads the system. There's no middle ground when your brain can only safely process the extremes. And that brings us to avoiding complexity. You know how some folks insist on the absolute shortest, simplest opinions over nuanced explanations? Well, avoiding complex topics isn't laziness, it's actually cognitive load management. Their working memory fills up instantly. To them, stretching their mind doesn't feel like growth, it literally feels like breaking.
Let's head into Section 3, Time and Self-Control. Tracking Consequences. Let's see how these processing limits build into an inability to manage timelines. These next 2 habits, a constant victimhood mentality and impulsivity, showcase exactly what happens when the brain's working memory just can't juggle multiple time frames at once. It creates a total disconnect between what is happening right now, what happened yesterday, and what might happen tomorrow. Enter the external locus of control. This is a genuine inability to see your own role in an outcome. It's literally like stubbing your toe and genuinely believing the chair attacked you. Every failure is just bad luck. Every single setback is someone else's fault. They lack the metacognitive ability to realize that their own actions actually lead directly to their setbacks. For most of us, connecting step 1, an action, to step 2, a consequence, is pretty automatic. But with these cognitive limits, they cannot mentally trace that line. And tragically, if you can't link your actions to the results, you naturally feel nothing is your fault. And therefore, absolutely nothing is in your power to change. This exact deficit creates a wild phenomenon psychologists call temporal discounting, which is a severe difficulty in projecting future outcomes. Lower cognitive ability correlates strongly with an inability to visualize the future. This traps them in a state of chronic chaos because their working memory is entirely dominated by the present moment. They literally cannot look ahead. They actually physically cannot visualize tomorrow's regret while they are experiencing today's desire.
The working memory just can't hold those two conflicting realities at the exact same time. So, the present moment always wins, completely dictating their actions and fueling all that chronic chaos.
Moving right along to section 4, when feelings override facts, the emotional defenses. What happens when analytical capacity is too limited to process external realities?
So, without the mental tools to analyze complex situations, people naturally fall back on these two habits, emotional reasoning and aggressive defensiveness. They end up using their feelings as their primary, unquestioned guide to the truth. In these cases, external evidence becomes entirely secondary. Imagine you're giving polite, constructive feedback at work. If their internal state feels disrespected, they accept that feeling as the absolute truth, completely overriding the objective reality of the conversation. Their internal emotions literally erase the external facts. And this whole process creates what we call cognitive distortion. The line between what actually happened in the real world and how they feel about it, it just vanishes completely. Again, this isn't a malicious choice. It happens because their limited analytical capacity cannot separate the emotion from the event. It all blurs into one indistinguishable mass. Because of this, you'll naturally see aggressive defensiveness over totally trivial matters. When someone lacks the mental tools to integrate feedback, even the smallest corrections feel like massive, brutal personal attacks. What looks like arrogance on the surface is actually deep insecurity paired with limited processing capacity. They argue aggressively over tiny details because zooming out to grasp the larger picture is just too cognitively demanding. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Cognitive Realities, Not Flaws, Finding Clinical Empathy. Here is the objective truth that almost nobody wants to say out loud. These patterns are cognitive realities, not moral failures. Intelligence and processing power aren't evenly distributed, and it is absolutely essential to approach this with clinical empathy. These 7 habits represent genuine architectural limits of the physical brain, not deeply rooted character flaws. Pretending that everyone has the exact same processing power, honestly, it helps no one. So the path forward requires 2 steps. First, recognize the habits for what they are. Second, adapt. Work within the reality of their actual capabilities rather than the reality you wish existed. I'm going to leave you with this final thought to consider. How can understanding these cognitive limits change the way we interact with others today? Think about how you can use this new perspective on cognitive load to transform your everyday frustrations into genuine empathy. When we see these behaviors not as stubbornness, but as cognitive overload, it truly changes everything about how we communicate. Thanks for exploring the fascinating mechanics of the human mind with us today.